My parents forced me to marry my pregnant cousin, but the twist? My brother is the real father. Buckle up for this one. My parents had always prized honor and reputation above all else, shaping our family into a carefully crafted facade of perfection. Every action, every decision revolved around maintaining this image, no matter the cost. Under their watchful eyes, I learned to be the compliant son, quiet, rule-following, and dutiful. But nothing in that rigid upbringing prepared me for the secret that would tear through my life like a hurricane, leaving nothing untouched. The day it all began was as ordinary as any other. A soft breeze filtered through the open windows of our house as my parents summoned me to the kitchen. Their expressions were grave, even for them. My mother sat stiffly at the table, her hands clasped tightly, while my father loomed behind her, his posture tense and foreboding. Without preamble, they dropped the bombshell. Amanda, my cousin, was pregnant. The words hit me like a jolt, but the shock had barely registered before they delivered the next blow. They informed me that I was expected to marry her. My cousin, a woman I had grown up with, shared laughs and family memories with, but had never seen as anything more than, well, family. The demand was framed not as a request, but as an ultimatum. They were blunt. Amanda was in a difficult situation, and the family's reputation was at risk. I was the solution, the one who could absorb the fallout and shield our image from scrutiny. I felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Their rationale was as cold as it was clear. Amanda needed a husband to make things appear legitimate, and I was the most convenient option. The thought of being forced into this arrangement was nauseating. My protests fell on deaf ears. They dismissed my objections with an air of finality, insisting this wasn't about what I wanted, but what the family needed. I asked, demanded even, why the real father wasn't stepping up, why he wasn't taking responsibility for his actions. The silence that followed was damning. Their avoidance only fueled the storm building inside me. When they finally admitted the truth, it was like a punch to the gut. My brother, my parents' golden child, the one who could do no wrong, was the father. Their rationale became clearer, though no less infuriating. My brother, their favorite, had too much potential to be tied down by this mistake. His future was too bright to be burdened by responsibility. And so, they turned to me, the reliable one, the expendable one. I refused. The words came out of me with a force I didn't know I possessed. Their manipulation and twisted logic were too much to bear. My father's face turned red with fury, while my mother tried to guilt me with soft words about strength and trust. But I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I stormed out of the house, their voices chasing me, but unable to reach me. That evening, I went to Amanda's house. I needed answers, a shred of clarity in the chaos. When I arrived, her face was swollen from tears. Her guilt was palpable, her voice shaky as she explained how she had been cornered into this plan. Like me, she was a pawn in the family's twisted game of control. She admitted her fear, her inability to stand up to the expectations placed on her. She had gone along with the arrangement because she didn't see another way out. It was clear that she, too, had been crushed under the weight of our family's obsession with appearances. But while I felt some sympathy for her plight, I couldn't ignore the fact that she had allowed herself to be part of this charade. I left her house with a resolve I hadn't felt before. I wasn't going to play their game. This wasn't my mess to clean up, and I wouldn't let my parents or my brother off the hook. For once in my life, I wasn't going to be the dutiful son. This time, they would have to face the consequences of their choices without me. Our parents left no room for alternatives, presenting their decision as if it were etched in stone. But I refused to accept that my life would be sacrificed for their illusions. I left Amanda's house with the promise to myself that I would find a way out of this mess, not just for me, but for her as well. I was determined to break free of their control, even if it meant appending everything they held dear. In the days that followed, I began to formulate a plan. I knew the situation couldn't be resolved without confronting my brother and exposing the truth. The challenge lay in doing so without tearing Amanda down or entangling myself further in the family's toxic web. I sought out trusted friends, people who could provide advice and support, because this wasn't a battle I could fight alone. My brother needed to be held accountable, and my parents had to understand that I wouldn't serve as their scapegoat any longer. After several failed attempts to confront my brother, who skillfully dodged every opportunity for a serious conversation, I decided to force the issue. Late one night, I waited for him to return home. As usual, he strolled in without a care in the world, radiating the same carefree indifference that had shielded him from consequences his entire life. When he tried to pass me by, I blocked his way, slamming the door shut behind him. He looked annoyed, uncomfortable even, but still smug. He dismissed my attempts to hold him accountable with sarcasm and apathy, brushing off his responsibility as if it were someone else's problem. His nonchalance only fueled my anger. I laid it all out, telling him that Amanda's pregnancy and the charade our parents wanted me to play could no longer continue. His response was predictable. He shrugged it off, hiding behind the same shield of parental favoritism that had always protected him. He insisted that our parents would never let him admit to being the father and that, once again, they would clean up his mess for him. He mocked my determination, convinced that nothing I did would matter. But for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes when I told him I was done covering for him. I warned him he would have to tell our parents the truth, or I would. My brother laughed, a hollow sound meant to cover his unease, but he didn't argue. I left him with no way out, his usual smug confidence shaken. The next day, I arrived at my parents' house ready for battle. They greeted me with their usual commanding presence, immediately launching into discussions about wedding plans. Amanda was there, visibly anxious, while my parents carried on as if everything had been decided. They announced the wedding date as though it were a decree from on high, expecting me to comply without question. I interrupted them, stating plainly that there would be no wedding. My mother's shocked expression revealed just how unprepared they were for resistance. They tried to regain control, insisting that the family's honor depended on this marriage. But I had had enough. I told them the truth. I revealed that Amanda was pregnant not with my child, but with my brother's. The room fell into a stunned silence. My parents sat frozen, their carefully constructed reality crumbling before them. My father, refusing to believe me, accused me of lying to shirk my responsibility. My mother's tears began to fall, not out of remorse, but out of fear for what this revelation might do to the family's image. Their denial and manipulation didn't faze me. I stood firm, telling them they had always known the truth, but had chosen to bury it for my brother's sake. They had spent years enabling him, and now they were trying to force me to bear the consequences of his actions. But this time, I refused to play along. My father, furious and desperate to maintain control, accused me of defying the family once again. He demanded obedience, but I made it clear that I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply refusing to sacrifice myself to protect their lives. If they continued to cover for my brother, I promised to expose the truth to everyone who needed to know. Amanda, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. Her voice trembled with emotion, but there was a newfound strength in her words. She admitted that the situation was unfair and unsustainable. She refused to marry me, knowing that the father of her child was my brother. Her determination caught my parents off guard, rendering their arguments hollow. For the first time, Amanda stood up to them, insisting that what they were trying to force on all of us wasn't right. It wasn't fair to her, to me, or to the child. My father, frustrated and out of options, tried to regain control, but it was clear that the foundation of their plans was crumbling. I realized in that moment that I wasn't alone anymore. Amanda and I, both victims of the same oppressive expectations, had finally found our voices. Together, we would not let their lies dictate our lives. The room was tense, my father pacing furiously, his anger threatening to boil over. He spat accusations, claiming I was making a monumental mistake, that this path would destroy our family. But the irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Standing firm, I told him the truth he refused to acknowledge. This family had already been shattered by manipulation and deceit. I could no longer be part of it. Amanda began to cry, her tears falling freely. But this time it seemed as if the weight crushing her had started to lift. She declared that she would take responsibility for her actions, no matter how uncertain her future became. It was a pivotal moment. Her choice to face the truth marked the beginning of a transformation none of us could avoid. In the days that followed, the tides began to shift. Amanda stepped away from the suffocating grip of my parents' control and chose to confront the reality of her situation. She gathered her courage and directly faced my brother, forcing him to acknowledge the child was his. Though reluctant and defiant at first, he ultimately admitted the truth, cornered by both her persistence and the undeniable facts. My parents, however, remained fractured. They couldn't deny the truth any longer, but they couldn't fully accept it either. Their obsession with preserving our family's image continued to cloud their judgment, but the truth had already been exposed. There was no putting the pieces back together. For me, a sense of relief began to settle in, a profound liberation I hadn't experienced in years. The unbearable weight of their expectations had finally been lifted. I was no longer the family's scapegoat, no longer the one expected to shield their lies. But just as I thought I could finally breathe, the call came. I was finishing up some client contracts when my phone buzzed on the desk. Thinking it was routine, I answered with my usual calm professionalism, only to be greeted by a voice dripping with malice. The man on the other end launched into accusations, claiming I was trying to escape my responsibilities. Confused, I explained he must have the wrong person. My name wasn't Pedro, but Samuel. There was a brief silence before the man chuckled darkly, his voice sharp with disdain. He dismissed my denial, calling me the innocent twin, and demanded repayment of a $100,000 debt. Before I could protest or clarify, the line went dead, leaving me stunned and deeply unsettled. My twin brother Pedro and I looked nearly identical, but our lives couldn't have been more different. While I had built a stable, though modest, career as a freelance graphic designer, Pedro was notorious for getting himself into trouble. Still, this, an enormous debt owed to what sounded like a dangerous loan shark, was a level of chaos I hadn't expected. Panic began to set in as I tried calling Pedro repeatedly, only to find his phone turned off. The last time I'd seen him, weeks ago, he had seemed unusually restless, as though preparing for something reckless. Now I was left to clean up the aftermath. Yet again, the situation escalated quickly. Threatening messages began arriving daily, all addressed to Pedro but sent to me. They demanded payment for the $100,000, a sum I didn't have and couldn't dream of gathering. My career, while steady, didn't come close to affording such an amount. I searched for Pedro, reaching out to everyone we both knew, but it was as though he had vanished. No one had seen him in weeks. One morning, after a sleepless night, a loud knock at my door jolted me from my thoughts. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding in my chest. Two towering men stood on the other side, their presence immediately threatening. One of them, bald with a jagged scar across his face, stared at me with cold, unblinking eyes. They addressed me as Pedro, accusing me of trying to run and hide. I tried to explain, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me, that I wasn't Pedro, I was Samuel, his twin brother. My explanation only seemed to amuse them. The scarred man laughed mockingly, turning to his silent partner, who simply crossed his arms and looked unimpressed. Their dismissal of my words was chilling. Whether they believed me or not didn't seem to matter. To them, it was irrelevant who paid the debt as long as someone did. Their cold logic sent a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Desperate, I told them I didn't know where Pedro was. My words, however, did little to sway them. Their threats hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. I realized, with growing dread, that this was no longer just Pedro's mess. His recklessness had drawn me into the crosshairs of something far darker than I had anticipated, and now I had to figure out how to navigate it before it spiraled completely out of control. The tension in the room was palpable as the bald man delivered his ultimatum. His voice was ice cold, warning that if the debt, or Pedro, wasn't delivered within a week, the consequences would escalate. Their exit left an oppressive silence, the kind that settled in your bones and refused to leave. I knew their threat wasn't idle. Ignoring it wasn't an option. With the clock ticking, I launched a full-scale search for Pedro. Despite his talent for disappearing, I was familiar with his habits. There were patterns to his chaos, places he would retreat to when he needed to lie low. My first stop was an apartment he had rented a few months earlier. It was empty now, stripped bare of any clues. A neighbor remembered him leaving in a hurry, suitcases in tow, accompanied by a woman whose identity she didn't know. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. I kept digging, reaching out to his old friends and scouring his social media accounts, but Pedro had left nothing but a faint trail. It wasn't until I stumbled across a name, Sophia, that I felt I was getting closer. Sophia was an ex-girlfriend of Pedro's, someone he had dated a long time ago, but had kept in sporadic contact with over the years. She was private, elusive even, but if anyone had insight into where he might have gone, it would be her. I called her, forcing calm into my voice despite the panic gnawing at the edges. After a long pause, Sophia answered, her tone wary. When I explained the situation, her sigh betrayed more than annoyance. It was the exasperation of someone who had dealt with Pedro's messes too many times. She didn't know exactly where he was, but admitted that he had been involved with dangerous people recently. She gave me an address to a speakeasy on the outskirts of town, a place Pedro apparently frequented when his life was falling apart. I went to the speakeasy that same afternoon. It was dimly lit, reeking of alcohol and desperation. The atmosphere felt heavy, the kind of place where trouble lingered in the corners. Scanning the room, I spotted him. Pedro, hunched over a table in the back, his jacket unmistakable. He looked worse than I'd imagined, pale, jittery, and worn down by whatever chaos he had invited into his life. I approached him quietly, careful not to draw attention. When he saw me, his face twisted in a mix of guilt and dread. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the situation, his $100,000 debt, the threats I'd been receiving, and the ultimatum we were under. He lowered his head, clearly ashamed. He admitted he hadn't anticipated the loan sharks targeting me, but his regret wasn't enough to absolve him of responsibility. I told him bluntly that running wasn't an option anymore. He needed to fix this. Over the next few days, Pedro and I scrambled for solutions. We tried selling his possessions, though there wasn't much of value. Negotiations with the loan sharks went nowhere. They were unyielding, demanding payment in full. Meanwhile, their messages to me grew more ominous, hints that they were watching me closely. Time was slipping away, and Pedro's mounting desperation was palpable. Then one evening, Pedro floated an idea that stopped me cold. He suggested we offer to work for the loan sharks, insinuating that they might forgive the debt if we got involved in their other operations. My stomach churned at the thought. It was a dangerous gamble that would pull us deeper into their criminal world. I shot the idea down immediately, unwilling to trade one form of entrapment for another. As Pedro sank into silence, another thought began to take shape in my mind. Maybe the solution didn't lie in submission or escape. Perhaps there was a way to turn the tables, to outmaneuver the loan sharks before they could tighten their grip any further. It would be risky, but at this point, risk felt like the only option left. The idea of staying trapped in this nightmare haunted me every waking moment. The loan sharks' threats loomed over me like a storm cloud, and Pedro's suggestion to work for them only made my skin crawl. How could he not see the dangers of that path? But then, as my frustration simmered, a new thought began to take shape. What if, instead of playing by their rules, we turned the tables? Instead of scrambling to pay off an impossible debt or sinking deeper into crime, we could dismantle their operation and free ourselves once and for all. It was a long shot, and the risks were daunting, but what did we have to lose? We were already neck-deep in trouble. This was our chance to fight back. That night, I sat with Pedro at our small kitchen table, the dim light casting sharp shadows across the room. He nervously fidgeted with a glass of water, his unease evident in every movement. He started to say something, likely another excuse or a justification for his reckless behavior, but I cut him off. My tone was sharp, and my resolve unyielding. Listen, Pedro, I know you think working for these guys might solve the problem, But it won't. It'll only drag us deeper into their world, and we'll never escape. I have another plan, a real solution, and I need you to trust me." Pedro's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and his skepticism was plain to see. "Another plan?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. "What are you thinking of doing?" "These guys aren't idiots, Samuel. They know exactly who they are and what they're doing." "Exactly," I replied, leaning closer to ensure he heard every word. "And that's their weakness. They think they're untouchable, that no one would dare cross them. But they don't expect us to outsmart them. If we gather evidence against them, we can expose their operation and take them down. We can get out of this without paying a dime." Pedro's expression shifted, a mix of confusion and intrigue flashing across his face. "Take them down? How?" I explained the plan in detail, laying it out piece by piece. We would collect enough evidence to implicate the loan sharks in their illicit activities and hand everything over to the police. It would mean working in secret, keeping up the pretense of compliance, while carefully recording every incriminating word and action. The risks were enormous, but it was the only way to break free from their grip. Pedro hesitated, his fear evident. "Do you think this will work?" he asked. "What if they find out before we can do anything?" "They'll kill us, Samuel." I nodded, acknowledging the danger. "We have to be smart, careful, quick. Tomorrow we'll meet with them and pretend we're interested in working something out. While they talk, I'll record everything. If we're lucky, they'll slip up and reveal something we can use." Pedro looked unconvinced, but finally gave a reluctant nod. He didn't like the plan, but he also knew that his idea of working for the loan sharks was no better. Between the two options, this was the lesser evil. The next day, we met with the loan sharks in a remote, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The setting was straight out of a crime thriller: rusted walls, the sharp tang of old oil in the air, and an eerie silence that amplified every sound. The two men who had previously threatened me were there, along with a larger group. Their leader, the bald man with the scar, was unmistakable. He fixed me with a cold, piercing stare, his expression a blend of amusement and menace. "So, Pedro," he sneered, deliberately using my brother's name, "have you decided to be a man and pay off your debt? Or are you still spinning stories about your twin brother?" I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. My hand brushed against the small recording device hidden in my pocket, its presence a reminder to stay focused. "We're here to solve this," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "We want to know if there's a way to settle the debt without cash." The bald man's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Without cash," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Pedro jumped in, playing his part. "Work," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We know you've got things that need doing. We can help. Let us work off the debt." The bald man let out a cold, humorless laugh, turning to his companions as if sharing some private joke. "Work? And what exactly do you think you could do for us?" Pedro continued, improvising with a confidence I hadn't expected. "I know people. I can get you information, help set up transactions. Whatever you need." It was a gamble, but it seemed to intrigue them. The group huddled together, whispering among themselves. I could feel the tension building, each second stretching out painfully. Finally, the bald man turned back to us. "Okay," he said, "let's see if you can be trusted. We've got something happening in 2 days. If you can handle it, we'll renegotiate your debt." They outlined the task: transporting a shipment without asking any questions. The details were vague, but clearly illegal. It was exactly what we needed. The recording device captured every word, and I fought to keep my expression neutral as they laid out their plan. When we left the warehouse, my heart was pounding. We had what we came for, but now the stakes were even higher. Over the next day, I compiled the recordings and detailed account of events before taking everything to the police. At first, they were skeptical. People rarely dared to confront criminals like these, and the risk of retaliation was high. But once they heard the recordings and understood the gravity of the situation, they agreed to act. An operation was set in motion to catch the loan sharks in the act. On the day of the sting, Pedro and I arrived at the new warehouse, nerves fraying with every step. The loan sharks were already there, preparing the shipment. The tension was suffocating. I exchanged a quick glance with Pedro, whose face was pale and drawn, but he gave a small nod. We both knew what was about to happen. The sound of police sirens shattered the air, and chaos erupted. The loan sharks scrambled to escape, but the police swarmed the area, cutting off every exit. The bald leader and his crew were arrested, their illegal activities exposed. Pedro and I stood motionless, watching as the operation collapsed around us. Relief coursed through me, though I knew the ordeal wasn't over yet. In the aftermath, Pedro was unusually quiet, his bravado replaced by something more reflective. He admitted his mistakes, apologizing for dragging me into his mess. For the first time, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "You've always been the brother who did the right thing," he said. "I never realized how much it cost you. Now I know." "We all make mistakes," I replied, my voice softer than I'd expected. "The important thing is what you do next. You have a chance to turn things around. Don't waste it." Pedro nodded, and though our relationship would never be the same, there was a sense of possibility, a chance to rebuild on firmer ground. As for me, life finally began to stabilize. The threats were gone, and I could focus on my career and ambitions without the shadow of danger looming over me. Most importantly, I regained a peace I hadn't felt in years. The experience taught me a powerful lesson. Sometimes, the only way out is through. Facing danger with intelligence and courage can reveal strengths you didn't know you had. What started as a $100,000 debt spiraled into chaos, but in the end, it became a journey of resilience, discovery, and redemption. Though the scars of this ordeal remain, they serve as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a path forward.